have been studying through the book of Daniel, and we've come to the end, and we titled this The Time of the End. And it's interesting how much of this information seems to coincide with our day, with our age. And so I'm going to share this with you. This is not in my notes. This is kind of an aside from what we talked about last Sunday when we told you about some of the new CRT movements and some of the political trends that we see in our day. So this will just compound what we talked about last Sunday. I heard on a news report this week that in 2010, the Boy Scouts of America allowed girls to join. Now, that's not too shocking, but we've seen kind of that sort of thing the last several years. In 2013, they allowed transgender scouts. In 2015, they lifted the ban on gay and lesbian scout leaders. In 2010, when this progression started, there was 2.7 million Boy Scouts in the country. Today, while religious groups, religious children's groups affiliated with training children and such have exploded in numbers, the Boy Scouts are now at about 700,000. So another instance of you get woke, you go broke. They're struggling to maintain their numbers. So Daniel chapter 12. That was just an aside from the news that we did last Sunday. So Daniel chapter number 12. Of course, this is the time of the end, a time of tremendous trouble, a time of tremendous shaking on the earth. This is a time that Daniel here describes, and it was this chapter goes with. It's an extension of what we read in chapter number 11, and so to remind you of where we've been, we say that the first. We talked about this last week. The first 4 verses here are God's messenger, and we've talked about deliverance. God has sent this message. He sent this prophetic vision to Daniel. And he does so by a very particular messenger. And let's read and find out who this messenger is, and we'll find out what message he brings. Daniel chapter 12, verse number 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, How long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,335 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest, and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So we see here that there is a heavenly messenger that is sent, and his proclamation is about the deliverance. It's about the deliverance of God's people At that time, of course, we said was the time of the end. The end is being described here, and Michael, the archangel, will stand up, and he's going to take up the defense of God's people. And Michael, we've said previously that his work is to command the armies of heaven, and specifically he protects the people of God. And so this is the angel that contested with the body of Moses, and he announces for us a time of great tribulation. Daniel refers to it in Daniel chapter 1 as the time of trouble. Jeremiah calls it the time of Jacob's trouble. We mentioned Ezekiel last week. Zechariah mentioned a refiner. He calls it the day of the Lord. And so all of these indicate a time of tribulation, a time of the end coming. Last week, if you weren't with us, we opened up Matthew 24 and we looked at the words of Christ and his predictions of the coming end times and the final and specific markers that he gives us as indicators that those times are upon us. And then Daniel here is recording for us. The other thing that's said is that there will be a resurrection from the grave. Daniel chapter 12, verse number 2 is a description of a resurrection of God's people. Most view this as a national resurrection. It happens very quickly. Some are delivered. Some arise out of the grave and enter into everlasting life. And some are given to everlasting contempt. So the deliverance is announced, but then in the next section, which we also talked about last week, there's a time of great delusion. Daniel says in verse number 4, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book. So we see that this is a sealed book. Much of prophecy is sealed. We mentioned this is the opposite of John the Revelator, who is told to not seal his book, but the book of Revelation. The word revelation actually means the unveiling. It's the unsealing. It's to make broadly known, to make known Christ and his coming. And so this book, Daniel's people, the Jews, do not understand the interpretation of this book as we've studied it these last several months. To the Jews, Daniel is very much a sealed book. So if you consider the comparison and contrast of Daniel and Revelation, you really need to study both of those in order to get a good picture of end times. Revelation is an open book. Daniel is very much a sealed or a misunderstood book at times, but it's not sealed to us. We understand it. The knowledge of the book shall be increased. We mentioned that last week, that at the time of the end, many will run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. And it seems that at the end of times, the Hebrews that have not understood this book historically will then begin to understand, and they'll understand the prophetic implications that Daniel was making. And so, Revelation is the unveiling, or the open, if you will, the open show of Christ, whereas Daniel reveals the Antichrist for us. There's much information here in Daniel about this person that we have come to know and title as the Antichrist, or the lawless one. He comes to us first in the book of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 37, he is called Gog of Magog. He is called the leader of Tubal. In Daniel chapter 7, he's called the little horn. In chapter 11, we see him described as the willful king. Here in Daniel chapter 12, we've read that he is the one that sets up the abomination of desolation. That, of course, is the same words that Jesus uses, as we read last week in Matthew chapter 24. Paul, in writing to the Thessalonians, calls him that wicked one. He calls him that wicked. And so we're given a picture of the Antichrist. But don't forget that while we are on the one hand seeing a sealed book and a picture of desperate times to come, this is still a a sovereign messenger that arrives on the scene. The next section was two heavenly messengers, those that we know as angels, that are speaking to a third person. This third person, as we read, was standing upon the waters, and he lifts his voice towards heaven. He is clothed in linen. He swears by him that lives forever. The description that we read there is very similar to what we read John describing the Lord Jesus Christ. It's interesting to me that the angels don't have the information to answer the question that Daniel asks. When will be the end of all these things? When is the end of these woes? And the angels don't have that answer, so they turn to this one that is on the waters, this one that is clothed in linen, and he asks, or he answers them, but he gives them what we call a shrouded answer. Verse 8, I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? He said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So for now it appears that it's a shrouded answer. At the end of times, when this prophecy will be completely fulfilled, these things will be opened up. They'll be plainly manifest. And so the answer that is received by Daniel is somewhat unintelligible. He doesn't understand what he's been told. He doesn't understand what he has heard. And he's reminded here in verse number 9 that the words are closed up. They're sealed. This is what the angel had told him earlier. He says, Thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book. So he's told that in verse 4, but he hears this information and he says, well, what does this mean? And the answer is, you're just not going to understand it right now. How many times do we have prayers and we ask the Lord for information and he gives us information that we just don't understand right now? We just don't get it. And we'll understand it soon. We'll understand it someday, but we don't understand it now. And that's what Daniel's told here at the time of the end. These are closed up until the time of the end. So it seems that whenever this end time, whenever this final period arrives, there's going to be an understanding, there's going to be a clear picture, a much clearer understanding of these things that Daniel has written. Perhaps when the end draws near, much of what Daniel has written will already be history. We've seen that in the earlier chapters. We have a pretty clear understanding of the beasts. We have a pretty clear understanding of Nebuchadnezzar's colossal statue, and we can interpret most of those things, which we have the benefit of history that Daniel didn't have. Perhaps enough of these items will be passed, and with enough of these things having already occurred, there will be sufficient understanding of what yet remains unfulfilled. We do know this. We do know that to the Hebrews and to most others that read Daniel, this book remains a secret. It's a mystery. It's just not understood very well. But there is understanding for those that trust in their God. We've seen deliverance, we've seen delusion, and when you come to the very end of this chapter, which is really the end of the book, you get to a period of delight. And I think that's where this chapter really draws our attention and it focuses our hearts and minds to, is to bring us to this period, this end time of delight. Saints always take delight in the purposes and the plans and the protection of God. And that's what we've seen consistently throughout this book. God's in control. God has a plan. God has a purpose. Even in the little things, even in the small things. Sometimes when he seems to be distant and far away, we know that he's ruling, or as he said earlier in the book, that he overrules in all of our affairs. Here we see those things clearly laid out by what Daniel records for us from this heavenly sovereign messenger standing upon the waters of the river. We see God's purpose in verse 10. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. There are many items here to be considered in the purpose of God. The first one is the pursuit of the saints. The pursuit of the saints, we see that many shall be purified and made white and tried. If you have your copy of God's Word, you can turn to Revelation very quickly, and we'll look at Revelation 6 and verse number 10. Revelation 6, let's start reading at verse number 9. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they, this is the souls under the altar, cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? And white robes were given unto every one of them. It was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. There's a pursuit of the saints that is predicted to happen during this end time that is confirmed by John in Revelation as well. Daniel predicts it when it is described by this messenger on the waters. Daniel writes it down. John confirms it. Revelation 12:11, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. It appears that during this tribulation period, there are going to be some saints that are martyred because of their faith. Now, depending upon your view of the tribulation, we can discuss where those saints arrived and how they got there. But we do know this. This Antichrist, once he is revealed, is going to pursue the saints relentlessly. Everything will be a death sentence. But we're also guaranteed in this same verse the perseverance of the saved, the perseverance of those that are righteous. Many shall be purified and made white when they're tried. Look at the end of the verse. The wise shall understand. You see, God's people will prevail in spite of these difficult times. These days appear to be days of unparalleled suffering, but there'll also be times for open demonstrations of God's protection. We'll see God's power. We will have clear demonstration of God's provision on the behalf of his children. And the text tells us that the world is not going to understand. The world will have no idea as they begin to pursue the saints and they begin to more actively and more openly persecute them and call them to sacrifice their lives because of their testimony for Christ. They're going to see that some of them are preserved. There's 144,000 Jews that are marked that can never be touched. Well, they'll be persecuted, but they can never be touched. And so as the world begins to pursue them and they see God's protection on them, it frustrates them. And it causes them to lash out even more against the righteous children of God. What did John say? Marvel not, my brethren, if the world hate you. Jesus said in John 15, if the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. Luke quotes Jesus in Luke chapter 6, blessed are you when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. You see, the test of our faithfulness is not how many friends we have. It's not how many likes we have. The test of our faithfulness is often, blessed are you, and men shall hate you and separate you from their company. Truth divides. And we see here the perplexity of the unrighteous. In the same verse, the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. It seems that as evil men and evil people continue down this road of perdition and continue in their persecution of the saints, they have no understanding. If you read in Ezekiel 38 the descriptions of the Antichrist, you'll see that he is judged because of his evil doings, and the world is judged with him. And yet, in spite of all of these judgments, no one repents. No one repents of their evil deeds. No one repents of their murders. No one repents of the things that they've done that have been an affront and an assault to a holy God. We see here in our text in Daniel chapter 12, verse 10, that there's a perplexity of these unrighteous persons. It appears that oftentimes there is a purpose that is fulfilled when we allow men's unrighteousness to run its full course. As we said on Sunday, there are times when the fall is so much greater when someone is lifted up to the height of the mountain before they're cast down to the pit of despair. And oftentimes it is God's purpose that allows men's unrighteousness to run that course. The children of Abraham did not conquer the land of Canaan before they went to Egypt, first of all, because serving in Egypt for 400 years was prophetically predicted, but the prophets said the cup of the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. And so the Lord allows these evil workers to pursue their sinful lifestyles until the cup of their iniquity is full. We see the same at the Tower of Babel. We see the same thing in Noah's day at the time of the flood. And God allows them a period of time for repentance, but allows them only wicked men that will fill the cup of their iniquity. God allowed the wickedness of men to reach great heights before he destroyed them at the Tower of Babel and sent them to division by confusing their language. He allowed the wickedness of men to cover the entire earth before he pronounced judgment at the flood. Psalm 76 verse 10 says, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, and the remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain." So it seems there are some Gentiles that are allowed to go at least partway through or into this period, and they're the ones that are killed. They're the ones that are persecuted by the Antichrist. Again, you can go read Matthew 24 and you can read Revelation 13 that we mentioned last week, but there will be some Jews, there will be some Hebrews that are converted. There will be some Hebrews that are protected. That's what's discussed here in Daniel chapter 12. You can also read Revelation chapter 7. Revelation 7:4, I heard the number of them which were sealed. They were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. And so there will be some of God's children that are in this period of time that are converted and protected. That's God's purpose. And I know we don't understand all of it, nor do we understand all of the details. But we know that God has a purpose. And secondly, we see that God has a plan in verse 11 and 12. From the time that the daily sacrifice should be taken away, the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth, and comes to the 1,305 days. I want you to understand that not only does God have a plan, but he's got a detailed plan. God's in control. You see this character called the Antichrist, he only thinks he's in control. But God has set the bounds of his control for a very specific time. Daniel tells us the established length of time for very specific events. He mentions here in our reading that it would be for a time and times and a half. That's 3.5 years. 1,260 days in the Jewish calendar. It will be 1,260 days, exactly 3.5 years from verse 7. The same thing is repeated in Revelation 12, verse 14. And so John and Daniel are viewing the same events. We know this is given in the middle of the 70th week, so 1,260 days remain, or 42 weeks. And there's 3 periods of time here that are mentioned then in the book of Daniel. When we studied in chapter 8, we mentioned the 2,300 days that referred to the cleansing of the temple. And then starting from the middle of this 70th week that Daniel is now describing in chapter 12, we see an additional 2 events. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to 1,305 and 30 days. And at the end of verse number 11, from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away to there shall be 1,290 days. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because 1,290 days and 1,335 days doesn't match the 1,260 days that is the 3.5 years that we're told this period of testing and trial and tribulation is going to last, does it? And so all of these events finish after the end of the tribulation period. The end of the tribulation will be 1,260 days. The end of these events come at day 1290 and at day 1335. So why do we have an extra 30 days and then another 45 days beyond that? All 3 of those events that finish after the tribulation shows us that there has to be some very important national events for Israel that happen shortly after the time of the tribulation. And we're not told what they are. Isn't that interesting? We're not given what they are. Let me tell you what I think they are and what the preponderance of the commentaries think that they are. We're not told, but most scholars believe that the extra 30 days is a period of national judgment. Christ comes, he returns at the end of the tribulation period, he defeats the Antichrist, then you have a judgment period. And this is not individual judgment, it is the judgment of nations that happens there. And then at the end of the judgment of nations, the other period of time, the 45 days, is Christ initiating his 1,000-year millennial reign on the earth. That's what the extra 45 days is for, is 45 days for him to literally, physically, here in Jerusalem, set up his earthly kingdom that will last 1,000 years. Those events likely occurred just before or during the very initial days of the millennial kingdom. That's God's purpose. That's God's plan. We're not 100% sure on what those events are, but we know from the time that that takes place that Jesus mentioned, the abomination of desolation. From the time that that takes place, you can start counting days. At 1,260 days, there's a significant event. At 1,290 days, there's a significant event. And at 1,335 days, there's a significant event. Now, all that seems really important, doesn't it? But here's what is really, really important. Here's the most important verse of the entire chapter. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. That's the most important. That's not talking about God's purpose or his plan. That's God's presence that is guaranteed. And it's guaranteed to the prophet Daniel. Remember here that he is speaking, and he is speaking to this one that is standing on the waters, and he's hearing this one standing on the waters that's clothed in fine linen, and he's lifting his hands up towards heaven. He is hearing this being, which I believe is the Lord Jesus. He's hearing him speak to him personally. And the commandment is, go thy way to the end, thou shalt rest, thou shalt stand in thy lot at the end of the days. That references what he just said in verses 11 and 12, the end of those 1260, 1290, and 1335 days. So notice what he's told here. First of all, you got work to do. You're going to work. Go thou thy way till the end be. What is the way of this prophet Daniel? Well, we're told. He was told previously in the earlier chapters. He was told here to write this book. Shut up the words and seal the book. Get busy writing. Get busy working. Go thy way to the end. And so this is a command for Daniel to continue his faithful prophetic ministry. You have a people to educate. You have books to write. You have kings to communicate with. Just keep on keeping on. Whatever it is that you're doing for the Lord, keep doing it. There is no quitting for this faithful prophet of God, and for the faithful child of God who is waiting for these times. There's no quitting. Retirement is not a word that we see in Scriptures. Now, retirement is something that we can do from our secular labor, but retiring from the work of the Lord is not in a Christian's vocabulary. Daniel here must continue to speak God's word to God's people. He has to write some things down. He has to speak before the heads of state, the dignitaries of several empires, those empires of which he has prophesied their fall. So he has an unpopular message. Remember, God sent a prophet named Hosea into an unpopular place with an unpopular message. God sent the prophet Isaiah and said, you go and you fill their ears with my words, but they're not going to hear. You go to a wicked, wayward, backslidden people, and you continue to preach the word. And they're not going to hear. But you deliver an unpopular message anyway. Go thou thy way. Keep on keeping on. Get to the work. If he hears nothing else, he hears there's a time coming and there's no more opportunity, so get to the work. Why? For thou shalt rest. There's coming a time when man works no more and all of man's work is done. And this word here, rest, is a euphemism that the Hebrews use all the time for death. He's going to die. Thou shalt rest. The faithful saints, the faithful servants of the Lord, well, they really don't die. Now, our spirit leaves our body, but it's referred to as a rest. It's a passing that is only temporary. And this physical body goes back to the ground, but our soul goes to be with the Lord. I've often heard it this way. You are a soul. You have a body. Your body is not you. You are your soul. You are what makes you up. This body is just a temporary dwelling place. In fact, Paul calls it a tent. If this tent were destroyed, we have a house in the heavens. Ecclesiastes Solomon tells us in his book, in chapter 7, that the day of death is better than the day of our birth. Why is that? Because we go to be with the Lord. And so as we see here, the ending, the closing of this book and the prophetic prediction that Daniel will work, and there's work to do, because one day he will rest in the dust. He will die. But the next phrase, you'll be raised. Thou shalt stand in thy lot at the end of days. You see, death isn't the end. Thou shalt stand in thy lot at the end of these days. What a tremendous promise. That is a promise of a resurrection. The earliest promise in the Old Testament of the resurrection was when Job said, I know that in my flesh I shall see God. After worms destroy this body, I will see God in the flesh. That's the first and earliest prediction of a resurrection in the Old Testament, but yet that's from the lips of man. You see this guaranteed prediction of a resurrection, and who's speaking it? It is Jesus Christ, the angel that's standing, the messenger on the waters, that's clothed in fine linen. Go to Revelation chapter 1 and read John's description of him. This is the promise of the resurrection spoken by the voice of God. Thou shalt stand. You're going to stand. Thou shalt stand. There is a resurrection. This passing from this life is only temporary. This life is only temporary. The permanent life is the life after, when we will stand. And he says, by the way, you're going to see a few things. Thou shalt stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So you're going to see some things. When he says you will stand in your lot at the end of the days, I want you to see this. Daniel has a lot. He has a place. He has a place not only that is reserved for him, it is a place that is prepared for him. And it's reserved, it's prepared, and it's guaranteed under his name. Thou shalt stand in thy personal possessive pronoun, right? Stand in thy lot at the end of days. There is a place prepared for the child of God. And twice in this chapter, we've been told that all of these things that Daniel has seen, and all of these things that Daniel has been told, they're sealed up. He's been told to seal the vision. He's been told to seal the book. But he says here, thou wilt stand in thy lot at the end of the days. In other words, Daniel, you're not going to understand now. But then, not only will you understand, you're going to watch. You're going to see it all happen. You're going to have a front row seat. Not right now, because right now it's sealed. Right now you don't understand. Right now you can pray for all of these difficult things that you don't understand, and God can answer your prayer. And sometimes the answer to your prayer you still don't understand, but just have enough faith in God that at that day you're going to see it. You'll stand in your lot. Go thy way. Thou shalt rest. You'll stand in thy lot at the end of the days. These are all personal. And so hear this. Our God is a personal God. He has an individual place prepared for his servants. So don't forget your service, your sacrifice, your surrender. God doesn't forget them. We're told that every tear is kept in a bottle. Every difficulty is recorded, and it's recompensed. And Daniel has promised that he will see with his own eyes, from his own place, in that day. That's how we close the book of Daniel. Just hold on. God's in control. God's given you the answers. And you don't understand it all, but He's working it out in history. It just takes a little time. See, we want our answers right away. God has to move some pieces around. He's working out His answers in time. But God is in control. That's the message of Daniel. Every detail of every worldwide empire is in His sovereign plan and in His sovereign control. And yet I see here the small details of our individual, personal lives matter to God. He cares. He's a personal God. He can be personally trusted. He can be individually known. That's what makes us different from all of the other religions of the world. Most religions don't present a God that is personal and can be individually pursued and known. The world is crazy. You didn't need me to tell you that, did you? Y'all watch the news once in a while? Did you know that there's evil rulers all around? Y'all follow politics at all? And I'm not taking sides. I mean, everybody's crazy, right? That's nothing different than what we've studied in Daniel's day. The world is crazy, and it's getting crazier. Evil rulers are all around, and they're getting more evil. Everybody's angling for more power. Everybody wants more prestige. Everybody wants more financial gain. But what Daniel tells us is that God is in charge. He is so much in charge, He sends His angels to intervene in world affairs. Did you get that? I mean, we read here 3 different times where something's going on in the world and God dispatches an angel to get involved. We read of a few times here the 3 Hebrew witnesses of Daniel chapter 3 when they're thrown in the fiery furnace. Here with Daniel in chapter 10 and chapter 12. Sometimes God has sent His very Son to intervene in the course of world affairs. And today He speaks to us through the Word and through His Spirit. We don't have all the answers, and we won't until what Daniel is told, until the time of the end. But what we do have is full assurance, and we have God as a final authority. And the last time that heaven's blessed Son intervened in world affairs was when He came and lived a perfect life and died on a tree to pay for sins as a propitiatory sacrifice so that we could have freedom in Him and righteousness through Him. And there's coming another time. The next time Christ comes to intervene in world affairs, He's not coming as a meek, suffering servant. He's coming as a mighty, sovereign king. He's going to destroy the Antichrist. He's going to judge the nations. forward to that time when our King comes. That's when Nebuchadnezzar's statue will be pulverized by the rock that's cut out of the mountain without hands. We see a parade of beasts. Those beasts will all be slain. And at that time, Daniel will stand in thy lot at the end of the days. And at that time, well, Derek and Steve and Tyler and Jason and Nathan, there'll be a bunch of guys standing there with Daniel. You'll have your part as faithful servants of this coming, conquering, sovereign, righteous ruler. That's what happens the next time God sends his Son to intervene in world affairs. I'm looking forward to that day, when we stand in our lot at the end of days with all of the faithful saints of all of the ages, worshiping and singing praise to the righteous King of heaven and earth. I pray that you know him. I pray that you're looking forward to that day as well. Let's stand. We'll have a short hymn.